So, dear listeners, it's been a while. What started as an unintentional short break following the news about beginning work on our books soon turned into an unintentional very long break, during which we tackled 2 musicals, 1 opera, 2 plays, 1 panto, 1 job role change, 2 house moves, 3 bereavements, and a divorce. Folks, it has been a year. However, we are back and we have content planned for you alongside our books and other exciting ideas such as guest stars.
You may have also noticed we have some snazzy new intro music courtesy of Upbeat, with credit and compliments going to Kevin Macleod for that. We thought we would come back with something a little bit different and improved for you, with plans for great content yet to come, whilst keeping our core values of being an informative podcast with an often irreverent look at the past, laughs, friendships and tea. Or
wine. Are you okay?
No, I malfunctioned.
We're 2 paragraphs in. We're back.
Hey, people should know that I'm not the best at wording, which is great when we have a podcast and a book deal.
Yeah, that's a thing. So this week we decided, because we're kind of coming back with it.
Yeah,
we're going to go right back to our roots. Our very first episode, for those wonderful fans who've been with us since the beginning, was about the Tudors. Bitten off more than we can Tudor. Don't judge us, it was very rough and ready.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Please, when you listen to us, to that one, listen to the others and see our improvements.
Was it kids these days say? We hadn't quite found our voice yet.
We hadn't found our voice or our vibe.
No, we were... Yeah, we were fresh-faced. We were young. We did think it was then fitting to come back with that theme in mind, though, and talk about possibly one of the most iconic monarchs in British history, Emily's historical bae, and somebody who would make the Queen of Hearts look tame in her penchant for removing heads. It is, of course, Henry VIII.
Oh, how have we waited 5 years to do him? Anyway. And in this week's Ridiculous Death, we look at what happens when you're minding your own business in the back garden in Tudor England.
So, grab your jousting lance, prepare for a huge feast, draft the execution warrants of anyone who annoyed you today, and let's get historical!
As usual, we're going to give as much information as we can, but a caveat, a little. Whilst he was a royal, there are some parts of Henry's life that are a little patchy because evidence has become lost over time. But there is a lot more evidence about him than a number of others before and after him. We're obviously a little biased because he is such a fascinating historical figure who looms very large, pardon the pun, in the collective consciousness of the British people. But we are very much aware that he could be somewhat problematic at times. Personally, I think he's misunderstood. But anyway, the best way to think of him is as a spoilt child who was never told no, but then suddenly was thrust into a position he was never really prepared for. We'll be talking about this and also dispelling some common myths about him as we go.
First things first, let's go back a wee bit in time before Henry was born. In 1485, Richard III, the then King of England, was defeated at the Battle of Bosworth Field by Henry Tudor, making him the last English king to die in battle and bringing an end to the Plantagenet dynasty that had reigned since 1154 with the accession of Henry II. They were a fascinating, tumultuous and charismatic dynasty. There was certainly never a dull moment. Great for historians, not so much for the people who lived through it.
Well, no.
You know that curse, may you live in interesting times? That applied to pretty much all of the Plantagenet era.
Yeah.
And there's a good podcast that I've been listening to called A Dynasty to Die For, which was by historian Dan Jones.
Cool.
Who is to the Plantagenet era what Dave Stark is to the Tudors.
Okay.
And it talks all about the Plantagenets. And listening to it, I've learned a lot that I didn't know. And I'm like, oh, damn.
Well, that sounds really cool. We'll put a link to that podcast in the footnotes of this one.
Yeah, I mean, they definitely don't need our promotion.
Well, no, but it's not promotion. It's more...
Absolutely, I would recommend it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So that era ended, but the bloodline didn't. You see, Henry Tudor was the son of Edmund Tudor, who was the half-brother of Lancastrian King Henry VI and Margaret Beaufort, descended through a legitimised bastard line of the John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, and father of Henry IV. The houses of Lancaster and York had fought for the crown during the 30-year conflict called War of the Roses, which we have an episode for.
We have. I think it's a rose by any other colour.
Yep.
Yep. And it's a conflict and a half.
If a rose by any other colour means war.
Yes.
Yep. So I don't know how, but the name of our podcast just went ping.
It's like, remember. On the opposite side, so that was Lancastrians. Yes. On the opposite side were the Yorkists. Richard III, whose brother and predecessor Edward IV took the crown from the aforementioned Henry VI. Edward married Elizabeth Woodville, and they had a number of children, including the heir that was never crowned but is somehow always mentioned in the lineup still, Edward V, and his brother Richard, the famous Princes in the Tower. But we won't get started on that debate.
No, not yet. That's a later episode.
Yeah. And their eldest daughter, Elizabeth. As part of an attempted peace treaty, Elizabeth and young Henry Tudor were betrothed, this being seen as a way to unite the houses of York and Lancaster. However, this didn't go to plan, and battle ensued, as it always does.
Absolutely. After his victory at Bosworth, Henry Tudor was proclaimed King Henry VII, but he kept his word and still married Elizabeth of York. This was a politically savvy move, as his throne would not be safe from Yorkist uprisings and otherwise, even though he did spend most of his life still looking over his shoulder. I mean, you would.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because his claim to the throne was tiny at best.
It was really, really tenuous, and technically he took the throne by conquest, which is a legitimate way of taking the throne, but also dangerous.
Yeah, so he would be still looking over his shoulder. So it was clever to marry Elizabeth of York. It proved a wise decision in other ways, though, as by all accounts they did truly come to love one another and had a long and mostly happy marriage, resulting in 7 children, 4 of whom survived past childhood, which sounds sad, but was actually quite good for that time.
Yeah. Infant mortality was so commonplace. Their eldest child, Prince of Wales and heir to the throne, was, of course, Prince Arthur. Yeah, I bet you thought we were going to say Henry.
Absolutely, but we were so close to having a King Arthur.
We were so close. Sorry to disappoint. Henry was only a second son, and he wasn't even the second oldest. So in order, we have Arthur, born on the 19th of September 1486, Margaret, born on the 28th of November 1489, Henry, born on the 28th of June 1491, Elizabeth, born on the 2nd of July 1492, who died at the age of 3, Mary, born on the 18th of March 1496, Edmund, born on the 21st of February 1499, who died at 16 months old, and Catherine, born on the 2nd of February, who died at 16 days old.
Oh, that's young.
That is young, and Catherine's death was more than just a tragedy for her, which we'll find out in a minute.
As the eldest, Arthur was assumed to be the heir under the law of
primogeniture.
What a word! Which means the firstborn inherits. And so the education of a ruler went to him, including the castle of Ludlow on the Welsh border, from where he would effectively take up his position as Prince of Wales. As the second son, it was expected that Henry would likely enter the church and rise through those ranks, so his education was much more spiritual and scholarly. He had time to read and indulge in his passion for the arts, sports, and rhetoric. Most importantly, he was not sent away like Arthur to a distant castle, and was able to grow up with his sisters and under the watchful eye of his adoring mother and his grandmother.
By all accounts, young Henry, or Harry, as he was also known, sometimes also Hal, was lively and a spirited young boy with a great love of arts, who regularly impressed with his intelligence, wit, and talent.
1 second. So we have the second born, called Henry, or known as Harry, who was ginger, was lively, spirited young boy with a great love of arts, who was intelligent, witty, and talented.
And significantly more popular in the public eye than his older brother until he wasn't.
If one was to believe in reincarnation.
And considering one of the reasons he lost his popularity was a problematic marriage. Yeah.
History doth repeat itself.
I've often said that that Harry is the perfect combination of young Henry V and before he became king, and Henry VIII. Like, absolutely personality-wise. And
anyway,
well.
we do digress.
Yeah. So yeah, he drew the attention of Thomas More, who would later become a great friend and advisor to Henry as he entered adulthood, along with the Dutch philosopher and scholar Desiderius Erasmus when he was only 9 years old. Erasmus praised the young prince for his intelligence and his regal behaviour when he was a child. I mean, that's pretty cool.
That is. Henry had been given a number of titles by his father from a young age, including Constable of Dover Castle and Lord Warden on the.
Cinque Ports.
Of course.
Cinque meaning French for 5.
Oh, I didn't know that's how that's spelled. Yeah, crazy. Plus being invested as Duke of York, Knight of Bath, Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, Warden of the Scottish Marches by the time he was 3 years old. All in all, his childhood seemed to be going well. But how long does that last, really?
I mean, we have the benefit of hindsight looking back over history, and it's like, things are going great, but not for long. Yeah. Would it be us without a horrible histories reference?
Oh, Bob Hale.
Bob Hale is life.
Bob Hale. What would Bob do?
Probably have a meltdown.
I am Bob.
Right. To enable his conquest and victory in 1485, Henry VII used the help of mercenaries acquired in France. Whilst it's not completely proven, it is commonly believed that they brought with them an illness that was later known as a sweating sickness. This is a mysterious illness, and the origins of it have still not been identified. Like, people still have no clue, which I find fascinating.
Yeah.
Oddly enough, there have been no recorded cases since the 16th century.
That's odd. History mysteries confuse me.
Yeah, there's some things that you look at and you're like,
You'd think they'd have this is what it's like. We have consumption is now known as TB.
Yeah.
You'd think sweating sickness back then is now, but it's not.
Yeah.
It's just a thing that happened that doesn't happen anymore.
We can even cure the bubonic plague, the thing that wiped out half of Europe. So you should be.
Sorry.
I'm not
seeing a chest infection.
Yeah, to be fair, we're feeling a bit sorry for Emily at the moment because she had to come back early from the Download Festival because she had a chest infection.
I did.
So she has full sympathy and lots of cuddles and snackoos and Red Bull.
I have.
Yeah. So no recorded cases since 16th century. Once contracted, the victim would have a sudden high temperature, characterised by excessive sweating, causing intense dehydration, and death in a very short space of time. Sometimes hours. Like, it could literally act that quickly. You could get it in the morning, show symptoms in the morning, be dead by lunchtime.
That's crazy.
It's crazy, yeah.
For anything to act that fast, it takes a long time. It takes, a week for your body to get dehydrated enough that you die?
But if you are sweating so much, you are consistently being dehydrated.
How much must they have actually been sweating to sweat out a week's worth of liquid?
But also, if you look at the medicine back then, or the rooms and everything, they'd have probably been put in a warm, stuffy room in bed with blankets on them and a fire going, just to try and break the fever.
Mm-hmm. We can't say much, but you may learn more about sweating sickness in a book, possibly in 18 months' time.
Maybe.
In 1502, Arthur, Prince of Wales, was residing in his castle at Ludlow with his relatively new bride, a Spanish princess called Catherine of Aragon. Yep, that Catherine. Having married to forge a political alliance on the 14th of November 1501, 5 months after their marriage in April 1502, a bout of sweating sickness hit the castle. Both Catherine and Arthur contracted the disease, and whilst Catherine recovered, the young heir did not, and on the 2nd of April 1502, he succumbed to the disease and died, leaving Catherine a widow at the age of just 16, and instantly making Henry heir only aged 10. The now Dowager Princess of Wales, Catherine, was returned to London to live in Durham House during her period of mourning.
For those who might not be familiar with the term, dowager is a word that we use to describe the widow of a certain title. So if you were queen or princess or duke or duchess, as soon as the male version, the duke, prince, king, whatever, died, the woman would not be able to inherit the title. It would then pass to the next male heir.
Yeah.
But in recognition of the fact that she was at one point holding that position, she would be called the dowager, which basically means former, but still has a lot of power. So, Bridgerton TV series.
She's saying, going to mention Violet.
Yeah, so
was going to mention
you'll hear the character of Violet Bridgerton referred to as the dowager Countess Marquess. Yeah, I can't word.
She was known as Dowager Lady Bridgerton, and then when Anthony married Kate, and now she's Lady Bridgerton, she isn't called Dowager anymore because Lady Bridgerton has a new title. Someone else has that title now.
She would still be referred to as Dowager, but she would not have the power anymore. That would then pass to the next generation. Also, spoilers for season 2 if you haven't seen it.
Well, yeah. Well, we're not going to spoil season 3, and that's over enough. So
Yeah, this is true. So you'll notice that we have, and we'll be glossing over a lot of the lives of the men and women involved in Henry's story, and there is a good reason for this. This episode is about Henry. So, as with much of his life, the focus was naturally on him. The world revolves around Henry. Not in a bad way. Absolutely love him. But also, a lot of these people were really fascinating in their own right, with complex stories that we felt that given them only a paragraph or two in this episode would not be doing them justice. So it's easier to keep the focus on Henry and then do these characters the justice of having their own episodes later on. If you have a preference for who you'd like to hear about first, send us a comment or message on one of our socials. And shameless plug.
Here we go.
Whilst you're there, why not leave a review of our podcast where you're listening? It would really help us out. It would help us get the word out there and get more people listening. There's also a way to support us on our Buzzsprout page so that we can continue to evolve and bring you even better content.
Yay!
Anyway, back to the story.
Yep, absolutely. So, with Henry now suddenly thrust into the role of Prince of Wales, his education changed, and his father was keen for him to be removed from the tender influence of his mother and sisters. This led to a somewhat tumultuous relationship between father and son. Henry VII was frugal to the point of being miserly and was very subdued in character compared to his charismatic son. Henry VII was often considered tyrannical because of his taxes and policies, as well as his ruthless ways of dealing with a number of threats to his throne. In contrast, young Henry was very popular and charming, noted for his athleticism and his very good looks, very much drawing from the genetics of his mother's side of the family. The York family were very much known for their beauty and charm.
Yeah, the Plantagenet genes were strong with the Yorks.
Yes.
And Henry grew to, wasn't he like 6'2" or something?
Yeah, he was a tall man.
Yeah, I mean...
Which back then, it's tall now, but back then it was tall.
Back then he was a giant of a man.
Yeah.
And then as he, later in life, as he kind of expanded outwards a little bit as well.
He got fat.
I was trying to be polite about it. Yeah, he would have been one hell of an imposing figure.
Yeah, absolutely.
And when he was angry, could you imagine being in his presence when he was angry?
I would cry.
I
would cry.
I'd be like, nope, I'm out. Bye-bye.
See ya.
He was, in his youth, he was a very big, well, all through his life actually, he was a very big fan of active sports such as hunting, jousting and tournaments, all of which his father sought to prohibit for the sake of protecting his only remaining son and heir to the throne.
Which you kind of get.
Yeah, makes sense. Henry did continue to excel in his education. He learnt to speak Greek, Latin and Italian. He fostered a keen love of astronomy and cartography, which is like the creation of maps and using maps, and of course a talent for music, including composition, and it hasn't been proved either way, but the song Greensleeves is attributed to him.
I like to believe he wrote it.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure it was written for the purpose that people say it was written for Anne Boleyn, but I think it's very similar to his kind of style.
Yeah.
In order to secure the dynasty, however, it wasn't enough that he had to be educated. He had to also get married and begin work on securing an heir.
The marriage between the late Prince Arthur and Catherine of Aragon had been a very politically savvy one, securing the alliance with the very powerful Ferdinand II of Aragon and his warrior queen Isabella of Carlisle. Castile.
Carlisle's in Scotland. Scotland and Spain are two very different places.
How is that different?
I mean,
they both begin with an S.
They begin with a C. Carlisle and Castile.
Scotland and Spain, you idiot!
Oh, fair. But yeah, I mean, one is boiling hot and like lovely temperate weather and fascinating like
Scotland,
architecture. Right? Scotland, they're wandering around in shorts and t-shirt at 12 degrees. That's as hot as it gets.
Oh, well, I'm not good with words. We've been through this already.
Castile.
In order to keep his alliance, not to mention Catherine's sizable dowry, which means the price paid to her new husband's family for taking her on as his wife, thoughts turned to a marriage between Henry and Catherine when he came of age. Considering he was still pre-teens at this point, they were formally betrothed in 1503, but the marriage was repeatedly delayed.
One main reason for the delay was that Isabella of Castile, Catherine's mother, had passed away, and her daughter Joanna had inherited the throne and titles, reducing Catherine to simply the daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon, which drastically affected her standing in the eyes of Henry VII. So the throne of Castile could go through the matrilineal line as well as just the male line. So Ferdinand lost. He still had some command over his daughter Joanna, because Joanna kind of went mad in her late years. He still had some control, but he no longer had absolute authority in there.
It's actually shown pretty well in the TV show The Spanish Princess.
Yeah.
Which is about Catherine of Aragon. Very good.
It is. There is some artistic license.
Yeah,
but
like the White
get
Queen
there.
was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But a lot of the events were historically accurate, and it did portray some of the trauma that poor Catherine went through.
Yeah, it's a really good TV show.
Yeah.
Was it on Prime?
It was on Prime. I think it's now on Stars on Prime, so an extra subscription there.
Brilliant.
Yep. So Catherine was reduced to the daughter of Ferdinand, and that did affect her standing in the eyes of Henry VII. The wedding had been set for the 28th of June, 1505, but the day before, on the 27th of June, Prince Henry was forced to repudiate, meaning he disowned the contract between them by his father, who demonstrated quite cruel behaviour towards young Catherine by cutting off her allowance, forcing her to drastically reduce her household, and effectively live in poverty. I mean, it wasn't poverty in the way that, like, peasants understood poverty, but comparatively speaking, it was poverty. Ferdinand of Aragon did try to make things better for his daughter by appointing her as a Spanish ambassador to England, which meant she'd be entitled to a certain amount of allowance. But it did little to help, and she did continue to struggle financially, which she apparently bore with a great deal of grace and never wavered in her loyalty towards her former father-in-law. Like, the one thing that people say a lot about Catherine of Aragon is how much dignity she had.
Yeah.
In the meantime, through correspondence and a friendship and strong affection did develop between Henry and Catherine.
Which is really cute.
Yeah.
Following the death of his older brother and the sudden catapult into a position of such pressure under his father, Henry was to soon face a second and more devastating tragedy when, in February 1503, his mother Elizabeth gave birth to a baby girl but contracted childbed fever, possibly a form of
puerperal
infection. What's that?
It's basically an infection within the womb.
Oh, and she had a fever. This led to her death on the 11th of February 1503, incidentally her 37th birthday. The baby Catherine died just a few days later. In a sad echo of what would later happen to his son, the death of Elizabeth in childbirth broke Henry VII, and he secluded himself away, forbidding anyone but his mother, Margaret Beaufort, to come anywhere near him, including doctors and his grieving children.
So his whole family was going through this grief, but it affected him. And he was a man who didn't really tend to show too much emotion. And then he was just utterly devastated.
Broken.
And it's just, you can't help but feel sorry for him. But also the damage that would have then done cutting off his family and his advisors.
Oh God, yeah.
Having lost his brother, his mother, and his baby sister within about 2 years, along with his increased responsibility and fractious relationship with his now emotionally and physically absent father, it would have taken a toll on young Henry. In time, Henry VII would re-emerge and consider remarriage, including to Joanna of Castile, Catherine's sister. But he never did. And his reputation as a miser and tyrant worsened after his wife's death. So too did his behaviour towards his son and heir. Henry VII fully took over his son's education now to prepare him to be king, while securing treaties through effective foreign policy and raising funds through taxes and a lack of military campaigns, which would mean his son would inherit a wealthy, peaceful kingdom.
Which, to some extent, he did.
He did. I mean, the coffers were full. He had a lot of money. He had some great treaties in place.
Yep. Protecting his kingdom would not protect the man, however, and on the 21st of April 1509, Henry VII succumbed to an ongoing battle with tuberculosis and died. He was laid to rest next to his wife in a joint tomb at Westminster Abbey. At the age of 17, standing at an impressive 6'2", with flaming red hair and all the beauty, charm, and charisma of the Plantagenet line, young Henry was proclaimed king with great hope and optimism for a golden age in England, and so began the reign of Henry VIII, the Tudor tyrant.
Almost immediately, Henry carried out the first act of defiance to his father's memory and married Catherine of Aragon.
It's such a boss move.
It's like a middle finger up. It's like, you know what? Do what I like now. He ignored the need for papal dispensation, which is basically the permission for the Pope to marry his brother's widow, which his father had delayed in obtaining. He did get the dispensation, but he married her before it was delivered. And the dowry that her father had refused to send. So basically, her father said, like, we need confirmation that she's going to be okay and looked after and stayed for, and we need to make sure this alliance is strong, so I'm not going to send you the dowry until you do this. And Henry was like, well, I'm not going to let her marry my son until you send the dowry. So it was a great stalemate.
Yeah.
They had a relatively small wedding at the Friars Church in Greenwich on the 11th of June 1509, and then just 12 days later, on the 23rd of June 1509, aka the day we're releasing this, not 1509, obviously, 2024, but the young couple processed from the royal residence at the Tower of London to Westminster Abbey, where at the respective ages of 17 and 23, they were crowned King Henry VIII and Queen Catherine.
Aww.
Yeah. Happy Coronation Day to you. Happy ? Coronation Day to you.
That was beautiful.
Thanks.
I'm glad that happened.
Thanks.
This union seemed blessed as Catherine quickly became pregnant. However, on the 31st of January 1510, she sadly gave birth to a stillborn baby girl. The pressure to conceive an heir was great, however, and within 4 months, Catherine was pregnant again.
4 months?
I know.
Jesus, that poor woman.
On the 1st of January 1511, Catherine gave birth to a baby boy named Henry in honour of his father. A 2-day jousting tournament was held in his honour, called the Westminster Tournament, and huge feasts were thrown with dancing and marquess.
Plays with mass.
Oh, nice. A form of a Tudor play involving dancing, acting, and music. You can probably tell from our tone of voice and the fact that we never had a King Henry IX in England that the happiness did not last. Just 7 weeks later, baby Henry died. This tragic event would lead to a crisis that would forever change England.
Could you imagine? I think there's an alternative timeline out there somewhere where we had a Henry IX.
That's ridiculous.
And then, the entire Stuart line wasn't needed. We'd still potentially have a Tudor Plantagenet line.
We'd also still potentially be a Catholic country.
Possibly, yeah. Or we would have reformed a lot later and with less drastic consequences. Oh, sorry. I just burped and hiccuped at the same time. That was a really weird sensation. I apologise. My body's malfunctioning.
Today's podcast is being brought to you by Red Bull. That's what we're drinking today. We haven't gone for tea or wine. We've gone for Red Bull.
Other energy drinks are available.
They are, but we're drinking these ones.
And not for people with heart conditions.
Uh-huh.
So, that is his early life. He's now king, so let's talk about his early reign.
Yeah.
At first, it did seem as though the golden age had come with the young king and his loving queen at the helm, and there was a lot of talk about creating a new Camelot in England. There was a lot of that. But Henry's warmongering tendencies started to show themselves quite early on, and despite his older councillors advising strongly against it, Henry joined Catherine's father, Ferdinand of Aragon, in a military campaign against France in 1512. The conflict was part of the War of the League of Cambrai, also known as the War of the Holy League.
The then Pope Julius had proclaimed a Holy League against France. Think like a crusade, but within Europe, and you're thinking along the right lines. This was because of a pre-existing conflict between the French and Italians over land that the former had captured. The League consisted of Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and England.
In 1513, Henry invaded the north of France and claimed victory at the Battle of the Spurs. But by 1514, his finances had run dry, and for Henry, the present campaign was over. A peace treaty was negotiated with the help of a powerful new advisor to the king, one Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. The son of a butcher from Ipswich, Wolsey entered the priesthood in 1498 and rose quickly through the ranks, entering the service of Henry VIII on the death of his previous employer, Sir Richard Nanfan, in 1507.
Wolsey managed to negotiate a treaty and would maintain a cordial relationship with the French until his death, which is pretty significant. As part of the treaty, Henry's younger sister Mary was betrothed and later married to King Louis XII of France. At the time of the marriage, Mary was only 18 and her new husband was 52.
Ew.
Yeah. The marriage lasted 3 months before Louis died, allegedly due to his exertions in the bedroom.
Double ew.
Though no children came from this marriage, Louis was succeeded by Francis I, who would have had a tempestuous relationship with Henry.
Yeah, Francis and Henry were so very much alike and they clashed a lot.
Yeah.
It's worth noting at this point that Margaret, the older of Henry's two surviving sisters, had already been married off to James IV of Scotland by their father and had been living up there for some time. Despite their relationship, her marriage would divide brother and sister deeply in the coming years.
Whilst Henry was away fighting in France, Scotland saw a chance to invade, citing a treaty called the Old Alliance between Scotland and France. The Scots saw their ally being attacked by the neighbours that had caused them problems for centuries. They spotted a chance and took it. England was not left defenceless, though, and an army led by the Earl of Surrey and very effectively executingly managed by Queen Catherine met the Scottish forces at the Battle of Flodden in 1513.
The Scots had the high ground of Flodden Hill, so Surrey manoeuvred his army via the town of Berwick to bring them round and attack the rear. The weather was against them both, and as well as the artillery not firing, because gunpowder doesn't work when you get it wet,
Fact.
the land a lot of it was turned into bog. The Scottish troops were caught in the mire and were picked off by English infantry wielding billhooks, which is otherwise a common farming tool. So the degradation of a lot of this nobility being taken down by a farming tool wielded by common soldiers. Most of the fighting members of the Scottish nobility fell that day, including James IV, who apparently took a billhook to the face, making his young son, James V, king, and Margaret Tudor, the widowed Dowager Queen.
The body of James IV was taken to a lead-lined coffin back to London, but he couldn't be buried as he had to be excommunicated for supporting the French against Italy and breaking the Treaty of Perpetual Peace between England and Scotland, signed in 1502, and the reason Margaret married James. So he couldn't be buried in consecrated ground, and his body was left in the woodshed of Sheen Monastery in London. The Pope eventually gave permission for him to be buried, but it didn't happen, and somehow his head became detached from his body, and with lots of rumours circulating about it, including it being used in a football game before being taken to Great St Michael's Church and thrown in a bone pit.
Nobody knows what happened to his body, and Sheen Monastery itself is now a golf course, and Great St Michael's Church is gone with a pub now in its place.
Wow.
Don't know what happened to the bone pit, like the charnel pits underneath where his head was. Maybe he'll do a Richard III and someone will find him. A new passion project for Philippa Langley, perhaps.
Maybe.
After she's finished trying to solve the Princes in the Tower.
Fair.
His bloody coat was sent to Henry in France, as in his coat covered in blood. No, I'm not just cussing out his coat.
His bloody coat.
His bloody coat was sent to Henry in France as a token of the victory that Catherine attributed to him, even in his absence. So she's basically saying, we won this for you, my lord.
Yeah, clever.
And Margaret Tudor, temporarily regent of Scotland after her husband's death, would go on to make a rash secret marriage to Archibald Douglas, the 6th Earl of Angus, in 1514, which would result in her losing her regency and the custody of her eldest sons, James V and Alexander Stuart.
At Henry VIII's urging, Margaret fled to England, pregnant with a child by her second husband, and actually used the cover of gaining permission from the Privy Council to travel to Linlithgow Palace for her lying in or giving birth to escape. She eventually ended up staying in Harbottle Castle in Northumberland, where she gave birth to Margaret Douglas, who would later become Countess of Woollett. I was speaking way too fast. Who would later become the Countess of Lennox and mother of Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. The same Lord Darnley who would go on and be the tempestuous second husband of Margaret's granddaughter from her first marriage, Mary Stuart, better known as Mary Queen of Scots.
So, Margaret makes a disastrous secret second marriage and is forced to flee and lose her kingdom. Her granddaughter, Mary, makes a disastrous second marriage.
Yep.
And is forced to abdicate her throne. Well, technically after her third marriage, she's forced to abdicate, but yeah. So grandmother and granddaughter have a weird kind of echo there.
History doth repeat itself.
It does indeed, and apparently it repeats itself in very close circles in this family.
Apparently so.
Whilst Henry was dealing with the drama from one sister, his other sister, Mary, was quickly getting over the grief of losing her first husband by also marrying in secret. This time, the husband was one of Henry's closest friends and advisors, the man who was meant to be bringing the now Dowager Queen of France back home to England, Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, played in The Tudors by Henry Cavill, and oh my god, that's the role I fell in love with him with.
So good as Charles Brandon.
He is. He's got the cockiness right the way down.
Yeah.
And incidentally, what Brandon in Suffolk is named after. Because, yeah. So, by all accounts, the two were very much in love. But Henry was furious, as his sister could have been used to cement another political alliance, and he now no longer had a pawn to use. Or did he?
Despite the number of failed pregnancies, in 1516 Catherine finally gave birth to a healthy baby, though, sadly for Henry, she was a girl. Born on the 18th of February 1516, Mary was not the heir he wanted, but she would be useful for a political alliance, and she also proved that Catherine could carry to term and the child could survive. By now, however, the seed of doubt had been planted in Henry's mind about his wife.
Now, as we know, Henry saw himself as something of a warrior king, despite him not having a great deal of success on the battlefield. The conflicts in mainland Europe continued, and with the death of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian and the succession of his grandson Charles V, Henry found himself in England at the forefront of the conflict. Joining forces with Charles V and the then Duke of Bourbon, also called Charles, we'll just call him Bourbon if we have to refer to him, they continued the campaign against the French and her young king Francis, a rival, as we said, in looks and wit and ego to Henry.
Francis was taken prisoner at the Battle of Pavia in 1525, and though he was released by the Treaty of Madrid in 1526, he broke his word on a number of points in the treaty, and the conflict started up again. Being consistently on the battlefield, though, did pose a risk to Henry VIII, as should he be killed, England would be thrown into a succession crisis with only one daughter back home and no son. His mind and his eyes had started to wander, and it was common knowledge at the Tudor court that Henry entertained regular mistresses, something that Catherine bore with great dignity, though you can't help but wonder if this dress contributed to any of her miscarriages.
Incidentally, when he was younger, Henry was a bit like he had these women around him. He was quite charismatic, quite attractive to a lot of them. They would flock around him. He had his pick of them, but at first he was quite prudish.
Yeah.
Because of his religious values, and he did love Catherine at first.
Yeah.
But obviously he's known for his mistresses. But maybe looking back at it in hindsight, he probably wasn't as prolific with them as people would seem to think.
Yeah.
He just had quite a few notable ones.
Yeah.
Henry he struck gold in 1519 when one of his mistresses, Elizabeth, aka Bessie Blunt, a lady in waiting to the Queen, a regular pattern that's going to reform there, gave birth to a healthy boy who would become Henry Fitzroy, meaning son of the king, and he was called Duke of Richmond and Somerset. He was illegitimate, so he could never inherit the throne, but in a time when it was believed that the woman was responsible for the gender of the baby, Henry had proved that he was capable of having someone bear him a son. So clearly, in his mind, the problem was Catherine.
Yeah. And the marriage between Henry and Catherine became gradually more strained through the birth of Mary did see a slight resurgence in affection. His eyes soon turned to another of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting, the niece of Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, one Mary Boleyn.
Religious turmoil was starting to spread across the war-scarred lands of Europe. In October 1517, Martin Luther published his 95 Theses, arguing against the indulgence of the Catholic Church and the corruption that was rife in the clergy. The 31st October 1517 is a date commonly considered as the beginning of the Protestant Reformation in Europe, when legend has it that Luther nailed a copy of his 95 Theses to the door of All Saints Church in Wittenberg, Germany.
As a strict Catholic, Henry was very outspoken against the Reformation, considering the ideas of the followers known as Lutherans a form of heresy. With the advice of his friend and mentor, Thomas More, to guide him, Henry penned an eloquent pamphlet arguing against the 95 Theses and defending the Catholic doctrine and indulgences. And there's no way I'm going to try and say the Latin.
It was called the Assertio Septem Sacramentorum Adversus Martinum Lutheram,
aka Defense of the Seven Sacraments against Martin Luther. His pamphlet was widely distributed, and he was highly praised for it in its noble and intellectual circles, even being conferred the title of Defender of the Faith by Pope Leo X in 1521. How ironic would that prove to be?
Yep. Thing is, he had a lot of conviction,
He did.
He was very strong in what he believed in. It just so happened that what he believed in changed.
It did. Somewhat.
Sort of, yeah, a little bit.
Yeah.
But some question marks there.
Mm-hmm.
In the meantime, Henry continued his dalliance with Catherine's lady-in-waiting, the Anne Boleyn girl. All seemed well until a fateful day in 1522 when a new lady-in-waiting arrived. Following several years growing up and being tutored at the French court, Mary's younger sister, Anne, the other Boleyn girl, returned to England with the promise of marriage to her cousin, James Butler, the 9th Earl of Ormond. The marriage plans fell through, and instead she became a lady-in-waiting to the Queen, Catherine, where she naturally caught the eye of the king.
Now, Anne was no fool. She had been well educated in France, not just in the traditional sense, but also in the art of courtly love, and she knew from what had happened to the others, including her sister Mary, that when the king tired of you, then you would be dropped, and whilst your family might benefit from his favour, you would be married off quickly without much further thought. Anne played it smart, and not only did she engage the king's interest, she also engaged his mind. The trouble is, Anne was a reformer, and therefore a heretic, which was a dangerous thing to be at the best of times, let alone in the upper
echelons
of the English court.
Yeah, like the top tier. The succession crisis was starting to weigh heavily on Henry, and with 2 more sons being stillborn after the death of their first son, and only Mary surviving into infancy from a total of at least 6 readily known pregnancies, Henry started to wonder if there was a more supernatural reason for what was happening. Thus, in 1527, the King's Great Matter was born. Seeking advice from trusted sources, Henry began to doubt the purity of his wife at their marriage, starting to believe instead that she and his brother Arthur had indeed consummated their marriage, and therefore his own marriage to Catherine was invalid.
Yeah. It is cited divine law from the Bible book of Leviticus, which forbade marriage to a brother's widow if they had consummated this marriage on the grounds of it being a form of incest. The miscarriages and the early death of their firstborn son were proof to Henry that God had somehow cursed their marriage. The more he and others looked into it, the more convinced he became, and he charged Wolsey to assist in seeking a divorce through the Pope. This is the matter that would lead to Wolsey's downfall.
Yeah, I think the idea from Leviticus is that if you lie with your brother's widow and they have consummated, you're basically, they term it as covering your brother's nakedness. So you're essentially sleeping with your brother, and therefore the marriage should remain childless.
Yeah.
We know it wasn't childless because, Mary.
But yeah.
But in Henry's mind, Mary didn't really count. It was more that he wouldn't have any sons.
Yeah.
Wolsey knew that nothing short of success would keep him safe from the anger of the mercurial king, and he appealed to Rome for the divorce. The trouble was, the Pope at that time was being held prisoner by the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who happened to be Queen Catherine's nephew. So that was never going to work. Like, Wolsey was in an impossible situation.
Yeah,
this was not going to work. Not to mention the fact that by doing this, Wolsey was asking the current Pope to go against what a previous Pope had done by granting the papal dispensation for them to marry, meaning that the previous Pope would have acted illegally in the eyes of church law. So he's basically trying to get the Pope to say that the previous Pope had acted illegally and this was correct, but also you're kind of going against your captors aren't here.
Yeah, there was no way anything was going to come out good of that.
Yeah, it was not going to happen.
No. A papal court was set up with Cardinal Campeggio, yeah. Campeggio. Sent from Rome to oversee.
Please always say it like that now.
Okay. To oversee it alongside Cardinal Wolsey, and a trial was held. Campeggio was firmly in the pocket of Rome, however, and he ruled in favour of the marriage being a true and legitimate one, on the grounds of Catherine consistently pleading her virginity and by saying that, she and Arthur were never able to consummate.
Was it something along the lines of, she'd say, "Alas, for us it never happened"?
Yeah.
Yeah. So she would go to her grave insisting.
With that, they were young. They were in late teens. They'd just been married.
But also, from what has been recorded, Arthur was quite a timid and very sickly young man. /boy, but also he would have been very much aware at that point of his pressure, and they'd been married for about 6 months. They're going to at least have tried.
Yeah,
he's going to at least have explored a little bit.
Yes.
Plus he's a teenage boy.
Absolutely.
I mean, come on. I get why she would plead not.
Yeah.
It made perfect sense for her to do that. But I don't know. I don't know that I entirely believe it. But it doesn't warrant the way she was treated.
No, absolutely not.
His failure to achieve what the king wanted led to Wolsey falling spectacularly out of favour, and Thomas More being made Chancellor in his place. However, More was no more in favour of the divorce or annulment than Wolsey was, and he was instead too preoccupied with fighting against the spread of Lutheran heresy. He was very, very vocal about that.
Yeah.
Henry himself was facing a crisis of faith and held out hope that the Pope would still grant the annulment in the meantime. Catherine was removed from court and separated from her daughter Mary, who was also removed from court. Henry, however, continued to develop his budding romance with Anne Boleyn.
As mentioned before, Anne was savvy, and she wanted security for herself and her family. She also wanted Henry, and from letters between the two of them, it was clear that there was some genuine affection there, but she refused to just be his mistress, which gave Henry even more of a reason to push for divorce. Anne, meanwhile, worked on Henry from a religious viewpoint, along with the help of a fellow reformer who was rising swiftly through the ranks, Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell was a highly educated and well-travelled lawyer who had worked his way to becoming a member of Wolsey's council and a trusted advisor. One of Cromwell's talents was in effective administration, and he is credited with assisting Wolsey in dissolving a total of 30 monasteries in 1528 to help raise money for a project Wolsey was setting up, the King's School in Ipswich and Cardinal College, Oxford, part of the prestigious Oxford University to this day.
I've never been to Cardinal College. I've been to Christchurch.
Yeah.
But I've never been to Cardinal College. But Oxford is beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely beautiful. Cromwell was present for Wolsey's fall, and he was determined not to let his career be affected. Wolsey himself had lost basically everything by 1529. He'd been stripped of his office and his property, Hampton Court being one that he had earlier gifted to the king, as well as the Palace of Whitehall, which Henry took over as a new main royal residence in London. Wolsey maintained his position as Archbishop of York because this was not really in the king's power to remove. However, on his way to Yorkshire, Wolsey was stopped at the parish of Cawood by Henry Percy, 6th Earl of Northumberland, and accused of treason.
You know what that means in Tudor times.
Yeah.
Wolsey was sent back to London, but whilst boarding a royal barge, he hit his head, causing a sickness from which he would soon die in Leicester on the 29th of November 1530, aged 57. Interestingly, the tomb that Wolsey had commissioned for himself was never used by him. Instead, he was buried in Leicester Abbey, which is now Abbey Park, and Henry considered using his tomb because it was quite spectacular, but passed up on the chance, and instead it is now located at St Paul's Cathedral, where it is occupied by another East Anglian, Admiral Horatio Lord Nelson.
I've actually seen that. I've touched the tomb.
That's
It's
really
amazing.
cool.
But it does make me laugh that someone from Ipswich, from Suffolk, commissioned the tomb, but someone from Norfolk ended up buried in it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Cromwell managed to step out from the shadow cast by Wolsey's downfall, and he found himself appointed as a member of the Privy Council in December 1530. So that's like Henry's inner circle.
Yeah.
From here, he was able to work alongside Anne to bend the king's mind towards reformation, as well as advising on the legal aspect of the king's great matter even. It was in his best interest to get someone like Anne on the throne for the reformist ideas. One of the most profound arguments raised was that the king was anointed by God to rule England, and therefore was answerable only to God and his laws, not the laws of man, including the laws of the Pope. This argument played directly into Henry's ego, and the idea that he, not the Pope, was the supreme head of the church in England gave Henry the power to do what he wanted all along: divorce Catherine.
In 1533, the marriage of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon was declared invalid on the grounds that she had been married before to Henry's brother, and it was against the laws of God. Shortly after, in that same year, Henry and Anne were married in a very small ceremony at the chapel of Whitehall Palace, and just 7 months later, Anne gave birth to a baby girl, Elizabeth. The pregnancy had been so quick, can anyone say shotgun? But it was accepted that more children, and particularly sons, would soon follow, and that God was clearly happy with this marriage.
Yeah, they got married, and even based, if we think about premature pregnancy, 7 months later, math ain't mathin'.
The math ain't mathin'.
So, in 1534, England officially broke from the influence of the Roman Catholic Church, creating the first Brexit, and installing Henry VIII as supreme head of the church in England, starting the country on the road to Protestantism. The Reformation had begun.
Dun, dun, dun.
And that is where we're actually going to end it for today.
Yep, you're getting your first two-parter podcast episode.
Yeah, there was so much to talk about.
Henry is a big figure that we would have like a 4-hour-long podcast if we were going to do it all in one.
Absolutely. And as much as we know you love history.
And we love history.
Attention spans are a thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So part 2 coming out soon. I don't know when that's going to be.
At some point. It will be there at some point.
Yep.
Yeah.
I love Henry VIII. They're so, like, honestly...
He is such a fascinating character.
He really, really is. And, like, I don't think he deserves a lot of the crap.
No, I mean, he's not great.
No, he's not great, but there's a lot worse people.
Oh, God, yeah.
And really, like, I know the musical 6.
Yeah.
It's about, obviously, the wives. Obviously. But Henry's now mostly known for being the man who had all the wives and killed 2 of them.
Yeah.
He did so much more than that.
Yeah.
Good and bad.
I mean, yes, it didn't go well, but also with the wives, it's a lot more nuanced than simply he didn't like them and...
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, yes, he wanted to divorce Catherine to be with Anne. Yes, in black and white, that is it.
Yeah.
But also, he genuinely believed that his marriage to Catherine was immoral, illegal, and would be a risk to both of their souls.
Yeah.
And he also had to think about the security of the kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
He genuinely fell for Anne. He genuinely fell for all of them with the exception of Anne of Cleves, even though apparently they developed a really strong friendship. And the women themselves, it wasn't just, Catherine was really regal and graceful, and Anne was a harlot. And there's more to them than that.
There is, and we're going to do a separate episode on each wife.
Oh, God, yeah.
At some point.
Expect
Hopefully
lots of 6 references.
Obviously, in like, it'd be cool if we do it in a 6-week succession. We do, but we've got to write books and do other podcasts before that.
Yes,
we will do
full-time jobs as well.
It's full-time jobs. But we do absolutely intend to do a wife a week for 6 weeks.
Yes, that would be. And we're going to try and time it around. So, like, this episode we've released on the anniversary of Henry's coronation, and also it's his birthday later on in the week as well. So there is a specific timing to it. So we're going to try and see if we can specifically time one or more of the wives as well.
Absolutely.
So...
Ridiculous.
Before we do that, would you like a random fact?
Carrie's random facts.
Thank you. So
you gotta love my intros.
Earlier on in the episode, you mentioned the rule of primogeniture.
I did,
which is where the firstborn son succeeds to the throne. That was kind of the law for a while, but during the reign of William the Conqueror and his children, there was another law that was brought up called progenitor, which means being born in the purple. So it wasn't that the firstborn would inherit the throne, because sometimes the firstborn was a bit of an asshat. It was more that if you were born whilst your parent was king, you could inherit the throne if you were the best person for it. Which is why William I, his successor William II, was not his firstborn son. It was someone who was born in the purple, who was born when he was already king, and was also the most eligible person for the throne. And that continued for a while until the law of primogeniture came back in again.
That's cool.
So you could either be prima, born first, or plura, born in the purple.
Carrie's random facts.
So, ridiculous death.
Ridiculous death.
I'm loving your musical into this.
Thank you. I'm really enjoying being back. I'm having fun.
we're back in our natural habitat. We're home.
We are.
We're geeking out.
We are.
So, we said at the start of the episode that we were going to do... We did the Tudors because it was a throwback to our first episode.
Yes.
Do you remember what our first ever ridiculous death was?
I do, actually, and it's still one of my favourites. It's the one when anyone says to me, "Oh, ridiculous deaths, what's that mean?" Like... You laugh at people dying, and I'm like, listen to me. There was this man called Robert Calf that got killed by a calf.
I mean, it's the ultimate dramatic
It's the ultimate. Honestly, he got killed by a cow.
Well, I present to you another update of Suddenly Cow.
Oh, suddenly cow.
Also in the Tudor era, this is a sad story of Robert Rayner, who was from Norland in Yorkshire, and he was literally in his tenement, so like his land, pretty much his back garden, and he was just minding his own business, digging in his garden, doing whatever it was he was doing, when all of a sudden a bull appeared and knocked him to the ground, mortally wounding him. So he's literally out in his back garden, and suddenly cow. Could you imagine? Like, could you imagine going out, you're just weeding, and then next thing you know, bull.
Well, like hanging your washing, all of a sudden death by cow.
Yeah, you just move your bloomers, and oh my god, there's a cow.
Suddenly cow.
It should be a new little shop of horror, shouldn't it? Suddenly bovine.
Oh,
Neither was Robert Rayner.
he actually prepared for suddenly cow.
I did. No. That's hence the word suddenly.
Oh,
No,
God.
it was a bad day for Mr. Rayner.
Oh,
Bless him. We will be back in a couple of weeks for an extra special episode
yes.
on the 4th
I'm
of July.
excited for this one.
And then we will start to drip feed the cow. My brain did not word. We're going to start to deliver
Yes.
more episodes.
Yeah, I would love to say we'll do them fortnightly. I'd love to. And maybe we will. But we have to give our first draft of our historical themed book on the 2nd of August. Yep. Which is about 6 weeks away. And so this one's coming out, and then we are doing a special one on the 4th of July. People in the UK may be able to possibly have an idea what might the theme be.
Spoilers, it's not
July.
It's not American independence.
We've
done
American,
the Revolutionary
War. Oh yeah, it's not American independence. Yeah. It's a UK based thing. And but then that's only less than a month to our books coming out. So whether we do another one in July, can't 100% say if we will or not. If we do, that means the book is going well.
If it doesn't, someone check in on us because we're not okay. So we will do what we can.
Yeah.
But if you do have any suggestions for anything you want to hear about, let us know and we will do it.
Yes, please. Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, all Cupboard History. And we'll be putting updates on there of different things we've got going on. It's all very exciting, and I'm glad that we're back. I've had fun.
You can even email us at cupofhistory@outlook.com. And
that was nice.
Yeah, that was nice. We, by all means, drop things in, and also if you have your own podcast, or you just like a shout out for any like local businesses because you've got your business Thimble and Kiss.
I do.
If you want a shout out, just drop us a line.
Absolutely. But until then, I guess we'll speak to you soon.
Right. Signing out.
We did it.
Woo! We're back, baby.